Welcome to Wow or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. It's ideas that matter to women of worth. So today we'll take a brief tour of the history of humankind. And what a distinguished guest we have on the program with us. So exciting to say welcome to Dr. Yuval Noah Harari. He's got a PhD in history from the University of Oxford, and he now lectures at the Department of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specializing in world history. He joins us on the line all the way from Jerusalem. Welcome, Dr. Harari.
Welcome. I'm very happy to be with you.
Oh, so terrific. Your book is beyond summarization. It is impossible to summarize your book. You take us so beautifully through 100 years of history. It feels like some observers say it's anywhere between 70,000 years and 100,000 years. But basically, the book answers the question, so very many questions. But one of the key questions is, how did such an insignificant animal like us, Homo sapiens, gain dominance if over 100,000 years ago there were 6 human species inhabiting the Earth? So, Dr. Harari, can you talk about these 5 other species and how it is we came to dominate all others?
Yes, we are used to thinking about the world as if it contains only one human species, and it seems very strange to people, the thought that there could be other species of humans on Earth. But it isn't a strange thought, because this is the case with almost all other animals. Today, there are many species of sharks or dolphins or birds in the world, like you have grizzly bears and polar bears and brown bears and so forth. So why only have one species of human?
Because we only we only see ourselves everywhere, right?
Yeah, and indeed, until about 10 or 20,000 years ago, there were other human species on the planet. We know for sure about at least 5. For instance, in East Asia, we didn't have any Homo sapiens. This is our species. But instead, on the mainland, the population was of a species called Homo erectus. And on Java Island and Flores Island in Indonesia, we know of the existence of unique human species to those islands.
And most of us think that, these different species under the genus Homo sort of existed on a continuum, and that somehow Homo sapiens were the result of evolution. But you say this is not the case. We actually dominated over these other species.
Yes, for a time we coexisted with them. There was a period in which at least 6 different human species lived side by side in different parts of the world. But then gradually, or actually very quickly in evolutionary terms, Homo sapiens spread from East Africa and conquered the entire planet and led to the extinction of all the other human species. And the big question is, of course, how our ancestors did it. What was so special about us, about Homo sapiens? And the best answer that we have is that Homo sapiens has a really remarkable ability to cooperate in large numbers. Now, all other human species could cooperate only in small numbers of intimately known individuals, like the chimpanzees and gorillas today. They can cooperate quite well with, say, 20 or 50 or 80 individuals, but they can't cooperate with hundreds and thousands and millions of individuals, of strangers, whom they never met before. And Homo sapiens can do that. Now, the big question of history is how? How come we cooperate so effectively with complete strangers? For instance, this very conversation, I'm talking to you and discussing these very interesting ideas, even though until an hour ago we never met, we never talked. So how come we can cooperate to create this radio show? And the best answer that we have is that sapiens can cooperate effectively with strangers because we can share stories about things that exist only in our own imagination. And as long as many people believe in the same fictional stories, they also obey the same laws, the same norms and values which are derived from these stories. This is very obvious with things like religions, but it's the same in the political and economic spheres, because things like nations or even like money exist only in our own imagination. I bring to you a piece of paper and say, look, I'm telling you a story. This is worth 10 bananas. And if you believe me that this piece of paper, which you can't do anything with it, but you believe that this is worth 10 bananas, then it is really worth 10 bananas, and we can have an economic exchange, and we have a monetary system. And this is unique to humans, to Homo sapiens. No other animals have money, and no other animals have religions. You can never convince a chimpanzee to do something for you by promising him that after he dies, he will go to chimpanzee heaven and there receive lots and lots of bananas for his good deeds. Only sapiens can believe such stories, and this is why we can cooperate so effectively, and this is why we control the world.
As you say, it is our stories which we enter through language, and also the sense of imagination that sets us apart from other animals. But we've never actually looked at the brains of any of these other 5 species or species under the genus of Homo. So do we know that is precisely what sets us apart from these other 5 species?
It is not absolutely certain because, as you say, we don't have any direct access to their brains and to their thoughts. But we do know, for example, from archaeological evidence that 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to form trade networks. For example, you find shells from the seashore hundreds of miles inside land in ancient sites from 50,000, 60,000 years ago, and you don't find any such thing with the other human species. And this leads archaeologists and scholars to the conclusion that they did not have any trade networks. And trade networks, again, they operate on the basis of trust in strangers, and this trust usually necessitates some kind of belief in a common story. For instance, we both share the same ancestral spirit, so I can trust you, and we can do business. And this is something sapiens can do and Neanderthals or other ancient species could not. There is actually a project in Harvard University that aims to bring back to life the Neanderthals. We now have a complete DNA scan, a complete genome of Neanderthals taken from ancient bones, ancient fossilized bones. And Professor Church from Harvard University has this idea of, with genetic engineering, altering the DNA of a fertilized egg of people from today so that it will match the DNA of ancient Neanderthals. The differences are quite small, so it can be done. And then put this fertilized egg in the womb of a woman from today and wait for 9 months, and you get a Neanderthal. And they say that with like $30 million, it can be done. There are even women who volunteered to carry the Neanderthal fetus in their womb. But currently there is no political and no ethical agreement on such a scandalous project, so it is not done. No. But he says that with about $50 million and the permission from the government, it can be done, and then we will know what Neanderthals are thinking about.
That is fascinating. In fact, just today I was reading there is new research that suggests that Neanderthals were not quite the brutes that we have thought them to be, because scientists have found traces of art in a cave in Gibraltar, which pretty much leads to the idea that high expression of abstract thought, which was considered the exclusive preserver of our own species, could have been done by Neanderthals.
Yes, there is. I also read about this new research. There was another find of this kind a couple of months ago, and today scholars are beginning to think that perhaps the gulf between sapiens and Neanderthals was not as large as we previously thought. The really big change came about 3 or 4 years ago when this project of mapping the entire Neanderthal genome was completed, and it turned out that about 4% of the unique human genes of modern Europeans is actually from Neanderthal ancestors, right, which means that there was some interbreeding, some kind of, marriages between sapiens and Neanderthals on a small scale, about 30 or 40,000 years ago. So maybe the differences were not as large as previously imagined.
Right, right. If we come back to some of the distinguishing characteristics that sets us apart from the other 5 species that once roamed the earth under the genus of Homus, and imagination is key to that. If cooperation and imagination is a keystone to our species' success in terms of survival, why do you say in the book *Sapiens* that humans are also the biggest threat to all other species?
Because our immense power, which is gained through cooperation and imagination, has basically turned us into ecological serial killers. We tend to think about the destruction of the ecosystem as something that began only in the last 200 years with the Industrial Revolution. But it actually began about tens of thousands of years ago with the spread of Homo sapiens from East Africa. We have evidence, for example, that when sapiens arrived for the first time to Australia, which was about 45,000 years ago, within a few thousand years, 95% of all the big animals of Australia became extinct. And the same thing happened later when sapiens first reached America. Between 70 and 80% of all the big animals of America became extinct. And it happened again and again whenever sapiens reached a new place like New Zealand or Fiji or Hawaii or any other new place.
Where previously these were sort of protected ecosystems, protected by the sea almost.
Exactly. I mean, the more remote islands were settled only in very recently, so we have more evidence about it, but it's the same phenomenon, that sapiens reach a new place, and within a very short time, most of the big animals that maybe lived there for millions of years disappear.
Okay, so now I understand your pessimism. It's ironic, though, isn't it, that what once allowed us to survive, and that is our ability to cooperate in large numbers, may not be the trajectory of Homo sapiens in the future. It's ironic to me. Let's talk a little bit about the cognitive revolution, Dr. Harari. Can you share with us a little bit about how that extended Homo sapiens' ability to survive and thrive and master the environment?
Yes, the cognitive revolution, which occurred about 70,000 years ago, this was a revolution. Nobody really knows how it happened. It probably resulted from some chance genetic mutations in our DNA, but it brought about new linguistic and cognitive abilities, especially this ability to imagine things together, to talk about things that exist only in our own imagination. And this enabled sapiens to start cooperating in larger and larger numbers. And this translated into things like trade networks, into things like larger tribes that can cooperate at least occasionally with one another, into the spread of technology, of ideas. And this, in turn, led to all the other big historical revolutions, like the advent of agriculture, cities, kingdoms, and all that. Even today, still, the power of humankind depends on our ability to cooperate, and the ability to cooperate still depends on all these stories which we keep inventing and sharing with one another.
Now, you've said, and I've read, you said, I encourage all of us, whatever our beliefs, to question the basic narratives of the world, to connect past developments with present concerns, and not to be afraid of controversial issues. I'd like to ask, as you were writing this book, was there anything in your research that stood out and that caused you to question your own beliefs at any point?
Actually, yes, a couple of things. I'll give just 2 examples. One good and one bad. One good discovery and one bad discovery about our species and even about myself. The bad discovery, as I was researching the agricultural revolution, I read a lot of studies about how animals were domesticated, and I came to realize that the domestication of animals was, and still, the treatment of animals even today is based on extremely cruel practices. I already previously thought about this issue, but I never realized how widespread and how really cruel these practices are. And especially, I thought that the main problem with domestication of animals and the treatment of animals was the slaughtering them. But it turned out that even the dairy industry, the milk industry, I was very fond of cheese previously, and it turned out that the milk industry is based on the same problematic practices. I never thought about it, but it's very obvious. I mean, why do cows or sheep produce milk? For only one reason, to give food to their youngsters. This is the only reason why cows produce milk. So you cannot have milk unless the cow is pregnant and gives birth to a calf. So from the beginning of the agricultural revolution and the domestication of cows, people got cows pregnant, then waited until the calf was born, and then took away the calf and usually killed it, and then milked the cow and drank the milk themselves. And this was the basis for the entire dairy industry, even until today. So I was shocked to realize that my consumption of milk and cheese and so forth is based on breaking the most fundamental emotional bond of mammals, the bond between mother and offspring, which is represented in the milk that the mother gives to its own child. And when I realized it, I stopped eating dairy products.
I see.
So this was quite a shocking discovery.
There were two,
A
right?
more positive discovery was that concerning human violence, my expertise was in military history. For many years, I studied mainly military history, and I was convinced that war is an essential part, maybe not a nice part, but it's a part of human nature, and there will always be wars, and there is nothing we can do about it. But as I was studying the long-term history of humanity, it turned out that actually over the last 50 or 60 years, the wars have been disappearing. International wars has been in sharp decline. There are less and less wars in the world. We are now living in the most peaceful period of human history. There are deep reasons behind it, and there are good reasons to believe that if these trends continue, within a few decades, maybe wars will completely disappear from the world. And this was shocking to me as a military historian to realize, but it's a very positive discovery, of course.
Thank you for sharing that. We're chatting with Dr. Yuval Noah Harari, the man behind the book *Sapiens*. It is not yet published. It will only be here in Singapore in 2 weeks' time. So this is such a wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much, Dr. Yuval. We'll come back and chat more with Dr. Yuval Harari after this. Stay with me.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
Welcome to WOW. I'm Michelle Martin. You're tuned to 938 Live. My guest, Dr. Yuval Noah Harari, in 2012 was awarded the annual Polonsky Prize for Creativity and Originality in the Humanistic Disciplines. Dr. Yuval, you mentioned that you specialize in military history. Now you teach world history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, or you lecture in the Department of History. Can you share with us a little bit about why you wanted to write *Sapiens*?
Well, I became interested in the really big questions of history and the human condition, questions like the relation between power and happiness. We're obviously becoming more and more powerful with the generations, but I wanted to know, are we also getting happier? Does all this power does us any good? And I realized that you cannot really answer such big questions unless you look at the complete picture of history. If you study only the Middle Ages or only the Second World War, you will never get answers to these really big questions.
So it's really your determination to answer the big questions that led you to look at world history. And do you believe there's still big gaps in our understanding of world history?
Yes, many. Very surprising gaps even. For example, one thing that I thought there would be a very clear answer to concerns the relations between men and women. We see that in almost all human societies known to science, with a few exceptions, men dominate women. And I thought that there is probably a very good and easy explanation for this. Now, the most common explanation is that men are simply physically stronger. But this turned out to be a very bad explanation for two main reasons. First of all, there are many examples from the animal kingdom, including our closest relatives, bonobo chimpanzees, in which females are indeed weaker physically, but they nevertheless control society. In bonobos, pygmy chimpanzees, females are about 85% have the strength of males, but society is dominated by cliques of females that cooperate against the males, and the males are subdued. Now,
okay, I'm going to have to ask you to hold the thought on that, Dr. Yuval, because we're coming up against a news break. So I really want to get to this question on why men seem to dominate women in all traditional societies or in all known societies. We'll come back and chat with you in just a bit. Hold the line.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
Welcome to Wow, or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. It's ideas that matter to women of worth. So today, a real thought leader. Such a privilege to welcome to the show Dr. Yuval Noah Harari. This month, the English edition of his book, Sapiens, will be released. It will be on bookshelves here in Singapore in 2 weeks' time. It's been described as a book that challenges everything we know about being human, and that in under 500 pages. The book will be released in paperback in just about a fortnight here. 65,000 people signed up for Dr. Harari's online course, A Brief History of Humankind. So we're getting an exclusive tour of the history of humankind. And just before we left off at the break, Dr. Harari, we like to think gender equality or gender inequality is something that we imagined into being, that woman's place in society has been largely dictated by prejudice if it's been an inferior place. But you say when it comes to relations between men and women, we've seen men dominate over women in many societies, or in almost all known societies.
Yes, in almost all known societies. There are some exceptions, but in most known societies, men have dominated politics and economics and also legally, in terms of legal rights. And one of the biggest questions of history is why? What is the explanation? As I said earlier, the most common thought of many people is that, okay, it's obvious because men are physically stronger, but this is not a good explanation for two reasons. First of all, as I said before the break, we have many examples from the animal kingdom of females, despite being physically weaker, nevertheless dominating society. And the second and even more crucial thing to realize is that in human society, social power and political power and economic power simply does not correlate to physical strength. Very often you find people in the 50s and 60s dominating, people in the 20s and 30s, even though they are stronger. Rich people are not necessarily stronger than poorer people. Religious leaders, say, I don't know, the Pope. The Pope doesn't get his position by beating everybody else. Even in organized crime, in the mafia, very often the big boss is not the person who is strongest physically, but he is the most cunning, and he is the one that can make the best alliances.
Right, so power
really
is not related to strength, so it was about being able to make those connections, you say, that explain why men have dominated over women?
No, my main point is that the original question is, what are the things we still don't know about human history? And this is one of the, maybe the most important example that we don't really know. How come men have dominated women in most human societies? This simple explanation of physical strength doesn't
hold up, yes.
And also another common explanation that, okay, women have to deal with children and pregnancy and so forth, it doesn't hold up for the same reason. Exactly because very often the task of taking care of children and so forth falls more on women. It means that women need to cooperate better. They need more help. They need to know better how to compromise, how to make connections, how to build social networks than men who are much more autonomous and much more aggressive. So how come the social networks end up being dominated by the men, we simply don't know at present. There are many theories. I discuss some of them in the book. I can't explain everything here. But at present, I think the safest, most honest thing we can say is that science doesn't have a good explanation for this phenomenon.
I just want to talk about this idea of imagined order, because you do talk about imagined hierarchies in this book, and I think gender distinctions can be understood within this framework of imagined hierarchies. For example, you say when discussing the creation of massive cooperative networks following the agricultural revolution, you talk about imagined order and devised scripts. And you say that different countries have different ways of ordering people into hierarchies, so to speak. India used class, the Ottomans used religion, America used race. Do we understand why different parts of the world use different ways of ordering people into hierarchies?
In many cases, it was accidental. It was some kind of historical accident that then people needed to justify it. So they invented some big story behind it, and it got perpetuated. One of the clearest examples is what happened in America with the racial classification. America was conquered by Europeans, and then the local Native American population was decimated, mainly by diseases, new diseases that were brought by the Europeans. The Europeans needed labor force, and they turned to Africa because in Africa there was already a very dominant established network of slave trade, and also because Africans were better resistant to the plagues that came to America. So this is why the Europeans chose to bring slaves from Africa. But once this system was in place of European conquerors using African slaves in America, it got perpetuated, and it got a whole new system, ideological system of justification, of people trying to justify why this is so. And they invented all kinds of stories. For instance, that Africans are naturally inferior, that they are lazy, that they are this, they are that. And this was just an explanation for an historical accident, but once people began to believe it, it became very powerful, so that even after the abolition of slavery in the 19th century, still these stories about races and the difference between races, they continue to influence American society even after the original conditions no longer applied.
Right. Interesting to see how the justifications kept social hierarchies in place. Is there a link between gender distinctions and historical change?
A link between gender distinctions? Well, in the field of gender distinctions, some things remain relatively stable. As I said before, at least until the late 20th century, in almost all societies we find that men dominate women. However, what does change a lot is the definitions of what is a man, what is a woman, how should a woman behave, what's considered manly behavior, how they should dress, what kind of sex they can have. Every society tends to believe that the way that men and women behave in this society, it's natural, it's always been like that. But when you look at it from a historical perspective, you see that these things change all the time. For instance, 200, 300 years ago, it was very, very common in Europe for men to wear wigs and makeup, and it was considered to be something very manly. The fashion today of men being far more, don't use makeup, don't put wigs, don't wear big fancy dresses and things like that, this is quite a new phenomenon. And similarly with sexual relations, we have many societies in which sex between men thinks that this is a natural, it shouldn't be.
Dr. Harari, how in your book *Sapiens* do you attempt to answer the question, have we become happier as a species as the world has evolved?
I think this is maybe the most interesting and important question of all, because we obviously have become far more powerful than before, but it doesn't seem that we have become much happier than before. And we have two main explanations for why this is so. One explanation is more psychological in nature. It points out that our satisfaction depends not on objective conditions, like how much money I have or what kind of regime there is in my country, but rather it depends on expectations. If I get what I expect, what I want, then I'm satisfied. And the problem is that no matter what people get, no matter how much more powerful they become, their expectations keep increasing. And therefore, even a huge increase in wealth of individuals or of entire countries does not necessarily cause them to be more satisfied because their expectations keep rising.
Right.
The second explanation is even deeper. It's biological. Biologists argue that all our emotions, including our feelings of happiness and joy and satisfaction, are really determined by biochemical systems inside our body. Nobody is happy because they got a pay rise or because they bought a house or because they found love. The only thing that makes people happy is pleasant sensations inside their bodies, which are dominated by these biochemical systems. And these biochemical systems, all the hormones and all the neurons and so forth, they have been shaped by evolution, not in order to make us happy, but to ensure survival and reproduction. And these biochemical systems tend to keep our moods and our levels of satisfaction within relatively narrow and predetermined boundaries. So no matter what happens outside the body, systems inside the body will keep us as satisfied or as dissatisfied as we were before. Only today, with the new knowledge we gain from the study of the body and with new methods of biotechnology, we develop the ability to start changing, re-engineering our internal biochemical system. And this is the first time in history that these systems may undergo a really big revolution.
Wow. Or we learn to separate happiness from emotions through will, right?
Yeah, there is, of course, different ways of understanding what happiness is. What I've been describing is the way that scientists, psychologists, biologists try to understand this concept. But there are, of course, other ways. For instance, in Buddhism, happiness is taken to be not pleasant sensations, but rather the way that we react or don't react to these sensations. If we react with craving to the pleasant sensations, then we become more and more agitated, and this is actually the source of suffering. Whereas if we stay equanimous with whatever happens inside the body with all these sensations, then we remain very peaceful, and this is true happiness. But this is a definition, perhaps I personally find it very attractive, but at least the scientific community and especially all the drug companies, they think along very different lines.
Sure. Dr. Harari, most see the march of history as increasing advancement and evolvement towards swifter or more effective cognition. Have we become smarter over time?
The simple answer is no, at least not on the individual level. On the collective level, yes, humankind today knows far more than our ancestors knew 10,000 years ago. But on the individual level, people probably know far less than their ancestors. There is actually evidence that the human brain has been shrinking over the last 10,000 years. Why? Because 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago, in order to survive, I personally needed to know how to provide for myself almost everything I needed. Yes, I had, of course, cooperation with other people, but I needed to know how to hunt my food, how to gather my food, how to prepare my own shoes and my own clothes and my own tools, everything. Today, on the other hand, each one of us is just a small cog in a giant machine. I just need to know, say, history, and I teach history and I get money from that, and that's it. Everything else I buy from other people. So I actually need to know far less than my great ancestor. For example, I don't know how to make my own shoes. I don't know how to grow my food.
Right.
If I needed to grow my food, I would probably starve to death. So from this perspective, it's very strange that whereas the human collective becomes more and more knowledgeable, the human individual is probably becoming less and less knowledgeable.
It's an amazing book, and one of my favorite parts of your book, Dr. Harari, is how you describe what the trajectory of the end of Homo sapiens could look like. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so our listeners are going to have to figure it out themselves by picking up a copy of Sapiens. Thank you so much for joining us here on WOW, Dr. Harari.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Dr. Yuval Noah Harari is the author of Sapiens. The book, already a bestseller in Hebrew, published in more than 20 languages worldwide, will be here in Singapore in 2 weeks' time. Thanks so much for being part of WOW. I'm Michelle Martin.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the WOW Club on 938 Live.